And we are live. Gonna give a few seconds to see if people are willing to come on in tonight. While I drink from my Robert the Doll cup, I'm going to write a comment here because I want a little bit of guidance today from the people who might be coming in. And what I'm looking for to start out with is, what is your town's urban legend? Right? They say that every town has its own urban legend, right? That every town has at least one story that everyone in the town knows, right? Everyone in town kind of gravitates to it. And it might be a creepy house in a neighborhood. It might be that person down the street who no one ever talks to. It might be the that local area in the woods that people talk about. What I'm looking for tonight is what is your town's urban legend? What is the story that comes out of your hometown or comes out of your area? And the more local you can possibly get, the better. Okay. So in other words, if you've got one that is like, a famously haunted place in your town, that's not what I'm looking for. What I'm looking for is the one that everyone in your town knows, but other people don't. Because I'm going to be talking a little bit about about how we learn to trust. All right, so Paul, if you're telling me the Beast of Turner, you got to write a little bit about it so we can kind of talk about it a little bit. Tell us a little bit about it, send some links to it, kind of give us a little bit of a thematic context for it. And I'm going to give you guys a second question that I'm going to put in there, which is, what the hell is a shadow person? Now, before anyone who's watching the video thinks that there might be anything paranormal in my house, no. Some reason I have been inundated with moths, and I'm not quite, all right, I can wait for you, Paul. I'm not quite sure why that is, why I've got to shift here a little bit, okay. Why we have so many moths in the house right now, but I can tell you why we still have moths, which is Ella refuses to let us kill them. So we have to wait till Ella's not around before we get them, because for some reason she thinks moths are sacred. And that kind of can bring me to my first idea that I wanted to express today. I would also like to say that I'm pretty sure just now someone from Boston College was chosen in the draft. And oddly enough, I had to have Natalie tell me that it was the draft tonight. I had totally forgotten. So my man card's being pulled a little bit. I am proudly wearing FGCU, hoping that an FGCU football player will be drafted. And seeing that there's no one in here from Southwest Florida, there is no football team at FGCU. But I believe a Boston College player just went in the draft before a Miami player. So every year I have a going bet with someone I work with that the Eagles will have a draft pick before someone from Miami, and I usually lose, but I think I just won. So anyway, enough football talk, because chances are most of the people that are in here are not football fans, so I can take that. All right, so I'm going to read Paul's comment. The Turner beast is a creature that has been described as a husky-looking wolf with bulky shoulders, big eyes, a flat snout, short mangled hair, and a bushy tail. Before it was proven to be a hybrid, some researchers claimed it could possibly be a dire wolf. It was spotted in Turner, Maine, and was estimated to weigh about 120 pounds. It has been known to kill pets and... the comment goes off. There we go. To kill pets and livestock, mostly dogs, most unlikely for territorial reasons. Later DNA testing of the animal in the pictures revealed it to be a wolf-dog hybrid. So it was a kind of thing where it was something real. It seems the Turner beast was something that was stalking the area, and then all of a sudden it was kind of found to be real. Now, the reason why I'm asking this is not just to collect as many urban legends or many stories as I can from different places. The reason I'm doing this is because I've been reading this book about folklore, and I reference it in last week's episode. And I'm now playing with my phone as I speak so that I can see what it is, because I'm totally forgetting the name of it. I'm doing it on Audible, right? So I've gone away from, I think, and it's called Haunting Experience, Ghosts and Contemporary Folklore. And one of the things that she's talking about in the section that I happen to be on is why we're more likely as adults to believe a ghost story. And part of what she talks about, and so I was trying to kind of grilling Ella about this. So if you've seen the episode, it's kind of funny because I'm like, answer the question. Was her idea is this: we learn these very simple ghost stories, and the ghost stories have a punchline. They're not necessarily scary, right? And they have this kind of like, boo, scary, and everyone laughs. And one of the foundations of it is that you jump out at the end and you scare someone, right? A lot like I'm not allowed to have this book out when she's up. Not because it's been banned from the house because it's so scary, but because Ella has banned it, because this is supposed to be many people's first induction into the ghost story. I never read this book until recently. I never read this book until I was older, until I was into not only ghosts, but until I was into folklore. And if you look through these, and it's funny because they're not scary. Maybe they're scary for small children, but there's nothing too much of them. And I think that was the point, is that the initial ghost stories, the ones that kind of set the template for this, are not scary. They're more like, boo, scary. And what she talks about in the book is that there's this almost like through these ghost stories, and you can kind of include in there almost paranormal fairy tales, kids learn to tell a story, but they also learn to tell a ghost story. And it's almost like paranormal training, right? So if you take a kid and you introduce them to these simple ghost stories, they're more likely to believe the actual ghost stories when they hear them. Or I should actually say, they're more likely to believe the next kind of level of haunted folklore, the ones that are scary, right? And so it goes from this, and I see I've got at least two people in the room right now, or at least that stopped by for a bit, who are from the Goffstown and Manchester area. Okay, so even though I don't advertise it too much to anyone who didn't grow up specifically with me, I moved to New Hampshire when I was 6. So even though I hail myself as being born and raised in Massachusetts, I spent a lot of my time in New Hampshire, in Goffstown, New Hampshire, which has a mystique about it. And I think that anyone who lives in Goffstown knows about it. But it doesn't have folklore. It doesn't have urban legends attached to it. I don't know if it was the distance between the houses. Now, when I was growing up in Goffstown, I had a friend who was 2 years older than me, and then a friend who was 4 years older than me, and then a kid that was 2 years younger than me, right? And so we all kind of hung around just because we lived so far away from everyone else. We were the only boys before you started getting into the high school kids. And so traditionally, and Natalie brought up a great point the other night when she was listening to Ella's episode, because I was arguing about how kids today don't have sleepovers as much. And therefore, that early level of folklore we were talking about, that scary stories to tell in the dark level, and then the kind of beginning levels, things like Bloody Mary or Candyman, or even like psychotic killers that are roaming the woods. These kinds of things, they're not shared as much in sleepovers, because kids don't have sleepovers as much anymore, right? So instead of getting it from sleepovers, instead of getting it from camp, because kids aren't going to camp, and I really couldn't get into this with Ella, but like, adults are creepy, right? So parents have moved away. They don't trust as much. And she brought up the excellent point that there are always cousins, right? And I've always told my kids, I feel bad haven't been raised near their cousins, because cousins are where you're supposed to get stuff, right? You're supposed to find out the stuff you're not supposed to know from your cousins, right? If your older siblings don't know it, your cousins know it. And if your older siblings know it, chances are they got it from the cousins. And so my point in all of that was that, these older kids never shared anything like that with me, right? I never got that from my older sisters. I never got that something creepy's in the neighborhood, that house over there, you don't know. We all knew each other. Everyone knew each other, right? And I think then maybe there's so many isolated communities in Goffstown that those legends didn't spread, right? Which kind of contradicts the traditional reasoning, which is the more rural an area is, the more folklore is going to spread. So it's really weird that this level, for me, this level of ghost stories didn't exist. When I was in second grade, third grade, I was not allowed to go on the bus. I'm trying to think back on it. I would love it if my mom would show up to this so she can maybe clarify some of this. By the way, I see people in here, but no one is sharing your town's ghost story or your theory on shadow people. So I want you guys to get vocal in here. But I wasn't allowed to take the bus. I think it had something to do with my parents not trusting my sisters. And so mom would pick me up after work from the library. And I became obsessed with the paranormal section of the library. So I jumped right from that scary stories to tell in the dark. I skipped that completely, and I went right to like the Time Life series, like things that were like about true hauntings that were adult-size hauntings by the time I was in second grade. So about that time when kids are reading scary stories to tell in the dark, when they're telling those like, boo, kind of stories that are meant to kind of inundate you or to introduce you, I was already, unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know, on to like the real stuff, which of course, is it real? Is it not real? It's kind of irrelevant for this discussion. I didn't come into contact with any local urban legends at all. My neighborhood was like a void. Like we just didn't talk about it, right? There was none of that kind of stuff. I remember one of the creepier kids in my neighborhood talking about the devil a lot, but we listened to a lot of heavy metal in Goffstown. So what are you going to do? And then I remember my first real urban legend experience was when I went, and this is the picture that I posted to kind of promote coming on tonight, was I went to camp. I went to Webelow camp. Anyone who knows me now probably finds it really hard to believe that I was once in the Cub Scouts, but I was a Tiger Cub, I was a Cub Scout, and then I think I went to like 3 meetings of Boy Scouts. Then I was like, I don't know if this is for me. And I can't remember his name. So I'm hoping someone who's in here, because I got at least one person of my youth in here. I remember the son's name was Matt McKay, I think. And I remember he was Mr. McKay, but I can't remember exactly what his name was. But I remember being at the campfire and being told a story about a man with a hook who was alone, who was stalking in the woods. He had escaped from a mental asylum. He was living in the woods near where our camp was, and he had the habit of taking his hook, because he had a hook hand, of course, right, and scraping the outside of the bunks where we were camping. And then we should always look for, listen at night before you go to sleep, and if you hear that, you know that he's nearby. And so we would kind of stayed up all night listening and being like, all right, and of course the camp counselors, the people who were running the camp, they would come by, they would scrape our things at night to kind of keep us freaked out. And then I remember them telling a story, and this is where it gets kind of non-paranormal, but kind of builds a really interesting base. Matt, you're going to love this if you're staying in for a bit. The first thing is, and this is really weird, but it kind of forms. Maybe I was the only person of the forums that kind of was able to take a step back and see this. We had, and I want to say his name. Should I say his name? His name was Mark Silver, I want to say. And for some reason, psychological damage, embarrassment, I don't know. But he refused to go to the bathroom in the latrine. And so he would go into the woods and he would poop in the woods, right? And he would actually do this, though, outside people's cabins. And so all these people kept waking up and finding crap outside of their little cabins, right? And to the point that it became this obsession with everybody. Who was, this is the names, who was the Phantom Crapper? And that's weird in and of itself. So, Mark, if you're out there somewhere, man, I hope you found the help that you need. But the idea of it was, from these little piles of poop, we got this really crazy idea of like mythology, right? And I don't remember before this necessarily having it in me. Like I said, I had some training with like books and a young, but it was, where had the Phantom Crapper come from? People were making up backstories of him that seemed very natural. He lived in the woods. He was marking his territory. He had no family. There were conversations that he might be the person with the hook. And the weird thing is that it seemed like the adults who knew or who should have known that this was not something normal. They should have been looking for the kid who was doing something weird and crapping in the what. They were feeding it. Right? They were feeding it, and they almost seemed to be mystified by these stories that we were making up about who this Phantom Crapper could be. Not paranormal, just a kid who, to this day, I don't know why he was doing what he did. And we eventually found him, but it took like 4 days, and at least 2 people went home. Now, were they homesick, or was it the Phantom Crapper? I don't know. I feel like I should take that picture that I posted and blow up the kid who was actually the Phantom Crapper so we can like totally put him on blast, which the kids don't say anymore. My point in telling you the Phantom Crapper story is this. A bunch of people, Natalie, I'm totally going to get to that idea a little bit later. That's an excellent idea. The people the situation we were in begged for folklore to be told. It begged for a ghost story to come up. As a matter of fact, some people even thought the Phantom Crapper was not a human. That was a ghost or a monster of some kind. And of course, at that age, you mix the two, right? There is no necessarily distinction between a phantom and a monster and a ghost, right? These things are all kind of the same thing for us. So we were like primed and ready, and these were the stories. These were the stories that drove us. And I don't remember like running into folklore again until, or like a haunting or things like that, until college, right? So I remember being really obsessed with the Ouija board. And one of the things that I think the author of that book glosses over is the importance of the Ouija board in my generation's development of the paranormal. It was a quick and easy way to touch the spirit world. It was the way that so many people I know got introduced to the idea of ghosts. They got introduced to the idea of like a spirit world, to conjuring, to having some kind of power over ghosts. And it was par for the course. And so what I actually remember is I have a Gothstown person in here now, so maybe you can shed some light on this. I had like my sisters would do it in their sleepovers. And I remember this very distinctly. My sister used to have a big like suitcase, right? Like an old, one of those old round suitcases, and it was filled with doll clothes. And I remember she used to take it out during the sleepovers, and it would be in the middle, and they would all be doing the Ouija board around it. And I remember a few times my sister's asking me to like do something to make everyone think that the place was haunted. And I was like, oh, okay, I did it. But there was and then I remember them telling each other's ghost stories, but the ghost stories were always, this happened to me, or I used to live in a house next door and this kind of thing was going on. So I remember very vividly Ouija board stories. And then when I got to college, that same kind of thing kind of prevailed. And I went to college at Emerson, where oddly enough, one of the myths was that Ouija boards were banned from the dorm. You couldn't use them in the dorm because the place was so haunted. Not true. Couldn't use a hot pot because you could burn the entire thing down. But then all of a sudden, that's when folklore really started to come into my life, and hauntings and haunted folklore really came into my life because we had the mysterious 6th floor that you could, or the 8th floor that you couldn't see from the outside because the mafia used to take people up to that floor and kill them. Why they took them up to 8th floor to kill them, as opposed to going a few blocks to one of the desolate the Fens area, it was never said. But also a little girl who died in the elevator. And I remember very vividly thinking, like, I've heard that story before. Like, how many little girls are dying in elevators? I don't know if we have statistics on this, but it seems like so many of these haunted buildings were having people who had died in the elevator. But then the weird thing happened, which was there was a suicide room, right? Because college dorms have to have a suicide room. So the room that's unoccupied because a suicide happened in it, and people were waking up, and there were the ghost of the woman, or they would try to kill themselves, and so the room was banned. But Emerson had two. They had a suicide room, and then they had the old person room. So anyone who's from Emerson and lived in Charlesgate knows that there was a woman who lived in one of the dorm rooms, and you never saw her. And she would sneak out to get her food when everyone else was asleep. No one was ever all asleep at Emerson dorm. People were going back and forth all the time, so I don't know when this shopping was happening. But she would go out, and she would smoke all the time. Now, the story goes that she had lived there for so long that she kind of got squeezed in. So even when the building was sold 3 or 4 different times, she still kind of got her room, so she never had to leave. I really want to. I think that we have to have Paul on, Natalie, just to talk about the Hat Man, because I think the Hat Man is absolutely fascinating. I know I'm breaking off, but I'm reading Paul's comments here. Long story short, stories began to develop that the smoking woman killed the old woman in the little girl in the elevator and things like that. And so I started to see that stuff mixed. That's kind of like the evolution of folklore in my life, right? I want to know what your stories are. So Paul gave a really good example, but I really would like to see how other people were exposed to the paranormal. Were you a scary story to tell in the dark? And it's funny because this book then like has its own mythology to it in terms of like where the pictures came from and the writing of it, but not only that, but I think for like the last, I think maybe since the invention of Facebook, there have been stories going around about this being made into a movie, and yet no movie. Like after at least 10 years of people talking about it, and the rights have been sold, and this GoFundMe and that GoFundMe, no scary stories to tell in the dark TV series on Netflix, no movie. So it almost has its own kind of like little thing going on with it. Second thing I wanted to talk to you guys about tonight, although we're running on 23 minutes, but I want to talk about this a little bit because Natalie and I are getting into this in our episode. We record the first half of the episode and we were both kind of like wiped out. So we decided we have to hold off for a little bit. I'm looking at the thing. We had to hold off a little bit and finish recording this weekend on it. And the big thing we're going to tackle was shadow people, as he pauses to take a drink. Okay, so anyone who is into the paranormal, whether you're an investigator or whether you're just kind of like you like the TV shows, or whether you just kind of have a passing interest in it, probably sees that these things go in cycles, right? And so, for a very long time. It was cryptids that seemed to rule the field, and then it was UFOs, and then it was ghosts, and then. But what happens is that even within these things, ideas come and go, right? So this idea of shadow people, while not a new phenomenon, kind of like has almost like a 5 or 6 year cycle of where they seem to really, really rise in popularity. You can almost kind of, like, if you take a step back and you can watch old things like See It, that goes through shadow people, and then it goes to ghost lights and this kind of it. There was a whole rod phase. Then there was, black-eyed kids seem to rule everything. Puckwudgies had their little peek up and everything. And shadow people seems to be one of those ideas that keeps going around because they don't seem to go away. So one of the things we wanted to talk about was, for me, was the shadow person in isolation. So we got an email from, I think, a listener, and hoping they're a listener, who was having a local, or had a local shadow person experience. And the really weird thing about this person's experience was he described the shadow person as crawling and moving without, moving kind of struggling, almost as if they were hurt or something weird had happened. And I had never heard that kind of shadow person before. And when I emailed back to him, I kind of said, well, that's really weird because most of the shadow people that I've heard firsthand accounts from, the shadow person seems to be confident and bold. So to have a shadow person crawling on the ground, I thought was unusual, but then to seem to be moving as if it was wounded was even more. Now, of course, much like we've discovered with puckwudgies, and much like we've discovered other things, like there's not one simple answer for what a shadow person is. And there's probably not one kind of shadow person out there, right? They could be various different things. I see we have, well, Natalie, if you don't mind, I'd love to read what you've posted on it. This is at least what Natalie has said about the rise of popularity. The rise of the popularity of shadow people is directly correlated with the ghost stories and urban legends not being shared as much throughout youth population. So I think what Natalie is saying is that there's like a buildup because of it somehow. Talking about those ghosts or legends gives them life and keeps them relevant. Putting that energy away from them by not discussing has caused their energy to morph into a shadowy form. Pulling a little American Gods here, I think. The stories ghost figures exist because as a culture, we give them a certain level of admiration, just brainstorming. And you could also maybe kind of along that same thing of like stored up energy, it could have something to do with technology. It could have something to do with affecting the atmosphere and having that cause darkness somehow. I'm not a scientist, and so it's really hard for me to expound on that idea. But Paul says shadow people are a form taken by the din. They usually appear as a humanoid silhouette or a hat man. Many people will see them as terrified by these sinister manifestations. It is said they feed on the fear vibrations energy given off by their victim. And if you haven't, maybe in this, when I post this as like a normal video in the comments, I'll actually put, or actually, Paul, you can do it right now. If it'll let Paul's got a documentary about this out right now. So that would be a really good, source if you want to get kind of more about Paul's information on this. But I'd love to have him actually on the show. And I would agree with some elements of that. Sorry, not so sure about the genie aspect of it. But my first exposure, and the reason why it sparked the discussion with Natalie and I is we were redoing the mini lights. So we were turning our mini lights experience into a travel log. And in Roser Park, I had seen shadow people pretty much stalking us. So as we were going through and trying to look for the mini lights, which we were under no illusion that they were real. We were just kind of going through the steps as a way to tell the story of the mini lights. It became obvious to me, both in noise and in excellent. Paul's posted his comment to his documentary, but we were being followed. We were being tracked in the woods, and it wasn't the first. I guess it wasn't. That's obviously not the first time I've seen them, but. And the weird thing about this one is they seem to be moving in the trees. So once again, there was a shadow person, but they weren't acting normal shadow person way. They were kind of sneaking back and forth behind the limbs of trees, but then also kind of like almost, which is funny because I'm going to get into like how they explode, almost like Venom or Spider-Man, like moving it in. I'm partly distracted because the Pat's pick is in, and it's probably going to be someone completely irrelevant who ends up being really good at some point in his life. But that led our be in our discussion. Now, the first time I heard about them was when I was informally interviewing people, students of mine who had experienced them. Liars, not liars, I don't know. But the number of juvenile delinquents who have been incarcerated in the state of Massachusetts who have experienced some form of shadow person during their incarceration is crazy. Again, right? These are kids who really have nothing to gain. Oh, really? Okay, so... And Paul's going to send us a free copy of that so that we can review it on Tripping on Legends. But yes, I totally want to know about that tree stuff. So I will buy a copy of it, or Natalie will buy me because my birthday is coming up. Anyway, I'm talking at least 24 kids over the course of 3 years told me almost identical stories. We did have shadow people in Holiday, but we're not allowed to talk about it. They would tell me these stories sometimes in pairs, sometimes individually, and sometimes almost always in hushed tones, right? And yet when they would talk about them, it was one of those things that was very commonly known. Like it was known that people in these places would see them. Now, they didn't really see them where I was at school, right? But places like, you're going to recognize some of these as kind of haunted locations, but especially Taunton State Hospital, which is in the Bridgewater Triangle. And that same shadow person was also seen by witnesses who lived in that neighborhood. And there's a whole story that I have in The Ghost of the Bridgewater Triangle about that. People in, I believe it was called Goss. People who had spent any time in the Worcester Juvenile Psychiatric Hospital. These kids all talked about being in their rooms and seeing a dark figure in the corner, no face, solid, oftentimes levitated in the corner, almost like hanging from the corner, like a ceiling plant or a wall plant or whatever they're called. I don't know. And it would just seem to be watching them. And they always got the masculine. So Paul, I would be interested in knowing from your perspective, have you gotten shadow people who the experiencer thinks of as feminine? Because these were always masculine, described as being masculine and intimidating and kind of in your face, even though they never actually did something. And yeah, they seem to be feeding off fear. They seem to be feeding off of not only fear, but negative emotions, right? And so kids often said things like, on the day of a restraint, this happened, or an escape attempt, this happened, or when they had a really bad day. And sometimes they didn't explain exactly what that was, but they would say, I had a really bad day. And Taunton and Goss are both kind of famously known for places where abuse had happened or reportedly happened. And so it was kind of like, all right, are we talking about, some kind of displacement where you're taking like abuse that might have happened from one of the people that was working there and placing it on. And these were hard kids. These were kids who had spent their lives doing that, kind of living life from facility to facility and things like that, foster home to foster home. And so, they didn't really have anything to gain by telling me the stories. And so many of them had similar stories, similar descriptions of activities, when it would happen, that I really took them for their word. They would tell me, if they told me that they had done their homework, I didn't believe them. If they told me, but the way that they talked about this seemed to be genuine. And so I put some weight on it. And some of those stories are in Ghosts of Bridgewater Triangle and other things that I've done. So I've also seen a shadow person in Valen Cemetery, who was much more of the big mass. So rather than being that sleek watcher, we had a Tai Pai Wonka experience where essentially we felt like we were in the middle of an arena, and there are so many flashing orbs in an area known for puckwudgies that we thought that we were surrounded. But it felt like we were being photographed by 10,000 people in an arena. And as we were going to leave, at least one of these shadow people literally rose from the ground. We were looking at these three, like a family headstones, and it kind of came up, and I was like, and that's the signal for us to leave, because at that point things were getting a little too intense. And so over the years I've been asked, like, what do you think these are? And I'm putting the question out to you guys. So we've got, why do they seem to come around, right? Is it just that other things pique our interest for a little bit, or is it there's something to do with they make their appearance and they go down, then they make their appearance? I've always, this goes to answer your question, Natalie, and we'll get into a little bit more. I don't want to get into too much between you and I here, but they always seem to be place where other paranormal stuff happens. So almost every other, one of the most haunted buildings in the state of Massachusetts, Goss, like same kind of thing. Metro, same kind of thing. Like these are all Met State. These are all places where people have frequently reported sightings of shadow people, and more importantly, other paranormal stuff has happened there. And so if we look at the experience that like Tripping on Legends has had, Roser Park, we think, Natalie thinks, is the site of potentially like the mini lights. The cemetery in Holiday is a cemetery in Holiday. Sanford, we were tracking the legend behind a ghost with no face, because the fish ate her face off. So it's one of those things where they always seem to be. Now, I see that I have a Goffstown person in the site right now. I don't want to say her name if she doesn't want to. Be known, but if she's willing to talk about anything that she knows from Goffstown, and also person from Goffstown who just came in, if you private message me, I know I've already hit up your husband. Hey, how you doing? I know I've already hit up your husband for a very weird birthday present, May 24th for those with you. But I have a huge favor to specifically ask you, Doreen, because I'm pretty sure you work in the Goffstown Library, and I am trying to track down that book. That kind of was the spark. I know you're coming in late, so if you want to go back to the beginning, and I'll talk all about that book. But I would love for you just to like video that the little kid paranormal section, and I would love to see if I could actually find that book again from the name. So, Doreen, if you could do that for me, you will be my bestest friend ever. And that's literally just like go through the books with me and like. If I was in the Goffstown Library and it was still set up, I could literally go in and pull the book out. That's how many times I took that book out of the library. So I don't know if you can look up my records and see what books I took out. I think this is before records. I think it was pen and paper back then. But anyway, back to our shadow people discussion. I would love to get other people's opinion on what it is. So we have that they are the jinn, and tell me if I'm mispronouncing it. We have a theory that it's maybe like almost like they've lost their total paranormal power because of our lack of recognizing them as much. And maybe that's why it cycles through. Maybe like they literally change their color. I've always thought of them, and in relation to Puckwudgies, oh, that's really funny, Doreen. Doreen says she actually works in the children's room. So somewhere out there's another little chubby me getting that book out. But there's the idea of them being watchers and energy suckers. So I would love, and not, I haven't gotten too many responses in terms of like what these things might be. So I'm putting this out there and I'm going to post it, and hopefully we start to get more actual posts on it. So I'm going to stop for tonight because we're already at 40 minutes. I could talk a really long time, even with Natalie not around. And not that you're not around, I know you're in the room. So I'm gonna stop here. I'm gonna post this because I want people to be able to, I want you guys to go in and I want you to check out the trailer and stuff for Paul's movie. But also I want you to, when you have a moment, and even tell other people, hey, like I was listening to this funny guy last night. Like, do you have one from your town? Do you have one from here? Do you have one from there? And how you got introduced to the paranormal, how the paranormal came into your life, what are the ghost stories, whether they're ones like this, or whether they were the more of the psychopathic killer or the monster in the woods or that haunted house in your neighborhood. I want to know as many of those as you can possibly give me, as well as to know what your idea about a shadow person is. And unlike my kids, I'm not going to ask you to offer any kind of proof. Theories are fine. I don't care how whacked out the theory is, but explain a little bit where you're coming from, and I would love it. So, and also keep in mind, we are knee deep or we are heart deep into the Haunted Love project. So if you have those ghost stories or creepy urban legends, creepy folklore that have as the center of them or as part of them a paranormal love story going on or have something to do with love, please send those to us as well, because we're not only looking to track them down, but we're trying to look for some common themes. And I think pretty much the theme is love will kill you. Pronunciation is correct, spell with a D though. That part I know. That part I know. So now, Paul, is it offensive to call it genie when it's, as opposed to jinn? Or are they different? You know what? Answer that question, so we have it there. But I would love to talk to you more about it and get your and talk about this a little bit more and kind of what their place in modern hauntings, but also modern folklore is. So I'm going to say goodnight because I got to go do the dishes and I got to go do some laundries as well. I mean, I've got to do more noble things than that. Whatever. I'm Chris Balzano. Natalie's in the chat room, I can see, and here's hoping that all your trips. I was kind of waiting for Natalie to finish the comments. Let's try it again. I'm Christopher Balzano. For Natalie, Chris, for all of us in the Trivial Legends family, here's hoping all your trips, whatever, are legendary. Have a great night.